A boy of 14 walks out of hiding and tells the world he is God's representative on earth. 2 years later, he's an emperor. His followers wear red hats, march into battle believing they cannot die, and slaughter their way across Persia on his word alone. His name is Shah Ismail, and the empire he founds will force an entire nation to convert at sword point, carving a wound between Sunni and Shia Islam that is still open 500 years later, still shaping wars in the Middle East today. That empire would build a capital so staggering that visitors called it half the world, and foreign ambassadors crossed continents just to lay eyes on it. Then it collapsed in disgrace, brought down not by a rival empire, but by a tribal raiding force of maybe 20,000 horsemen. The real killer wasn't the army at the gates. It was what happened inside the palace first. A dynasty so consumed by endless border wars and so terrified of its own princes that kings began blinding their sons, or worse, just to keep the throne. Excavations at Isfahan, some decades old and some recent, have turned up ash layers and human bone consistent with a siege so severe that European envoys stationed there wrote home about starving residents driven to the unthinkable. Historians still argue over the deeper cause, a silver economy hollowed out from within, or a clergy that had seized more power than the throne itself. What isn't disputed is the scene when the enemy finally broke through, an empty treasury, unpaid soldiers, and a king reportedly too drunk in his harem to lead a defense. This was a dynasty that had once stopped the Ottoman Empire cold, the only power in the region that could. So how does an empire that formidable end up destroyed from the inside, one blinded heir at a time? Persia in the late 1400s was a land without a centre. The Timurid Empire that had once dominated the region had rotted from within, fracturing into a patchwork of feuding local rulers, none strong enough to claim the whole. Out of this chaos rose a religious brotherhood that had begun, generations earlier, as something almost gentle, a Sufi order in the city of Ardabil, devoted to mysticism and spiritual guidance. Over decades, that peaceful order transformed into something else entirely, a militant movement known as the Safavids, its leaders increasingly claiming not just spiritual authority, but a divine right to rule. The family at the head of this movement paid a brutal price for its ambition. Rival powers, fearing what the Safavids was becoming, hunted down and slaughtered members of the family, including the father of a young boy named Ismail. The child survived only because loyal followers smuggled him into hiding in the remote, marshy region of Lahijan, keeping him concealed from assassins for years while he grew from infant to adolescent under constant threat of discovery. He was 12 years old. What followed defies easy explanation. Within months, this child began gathering followers with a speed that stunned every established power in the region. His army called themselves Qizilbash, Red Heads, named for the distinctive crimson headgear marking their devotion. These were not ordinary soldiers. They were fanatics who genuinely believed their young leader was more than a king, that he carried divine authority, perhaps even that he was the return of a hidden messianic figure long awaited in certain strands of Islamic tradition. Soldiers who believe their commander is untouchable by God do not retreat. In 1501, at the age of 14, Ismail led his Qizilbash forces to capture the city of Tabriz. Standing amid the city he had just conquered, the teenage warlord declared himself Shah, Emperor of Persia. For the first time since the Arab conquests centuries earlier had brought Islam to the region, Persia stood unified again under a single native dynasty. A boy who had spent his childhood in hiding from assassins now commanded an empire that would reshape the religious map of the entire Middle East. The speed of this rise is difficult to overstate in the context of the era. Most successful conquerors of the period spent decades building alliances, testing rivals, and slowly accumulating territory before daring to claim a throne. Ismail achieved in roughly 2 years what many rulers never managed across an entire lifetime, a fact his followers took as further proof of his divine favor. His court poetry, composed in a Turkic dialect under the pen name Hatay, openly proclaimed messianic and semi-divine status, versus his Qizilbash warriors treated less as literature than as sacred scripture. This was not simply propaganda crafted by advisors. Contemporary accounts suggest Ismail himself genuinely believed, or at minimum deeply cultivated the belief among his followers, that he embodied something beyond an ordinary human ruler, a conviction that would prove both his greatest early strength and, eventually, at Calderon, the source of catastrophic overconfidence. The Qizilbash themselves came from a coalition of 7 distinct Turkic tribal groups, each maintaining its own regional power base, its own commanders, and its own competing ambitions even while nominally united under Ismail's banner. This underlying tribal structure would prove decisive both in the empire's explosive early success, since it allowed Ismail to mobilize seasoned warriors already organized into functioning military units rather than building an army from nothing, and in its recurring later instability, since those same tribal loyalties never fully dissolved into loyalty toward the Safavid state as an abstract institution rather than toward Ismail personally. It is worth remembering the sheer improbability of what these Qizilbash warriors accomplished in purely military terms during those first extraordinary years. Facing established regional powers with far deeper resources, longer administrative traditions, and battle-hardened armies of their own, a coalition organized around a teenage religious figure managed to sweep across the Iranian plateau in a campaign of conquest that outpaced almost every comparable rise to power in the medieval and early modern Islamic world. Contemporary chroniclers, both sympathetic and hostile to Ismail's cause, agreed on one point. Nothing in the recent history of the region had prepared anyone for the speed and totality of what this movement achieved in so short a span of time. Ismail's early administrative choices as he consolidated power also revealed a ruler capable of pragmatic governance well beyond his years, even as the religious fervor of his movement continued to define its public identity. He retained many experienced Persian bureaucrats from the previous Timurid-era administrative system, recognizing that his Qizilbash military commanders, however fierce in battle, generally lacked the specialized skills needed to manage tax collection, land administration, and the countless practical details of running a functioning state. This willingness to blend Turkic military leadership with Persian administrative expertise would become a defining, recurring feature of Safavid governance for generations to come, even as the balance of power between these two groups shifted repeatedly over the following 2 centuries. Having seized power, Ismail made a decision of staggering consequence, one that would echo through the centuries far beyond his own lifetime. He declared Shia Islam the official state religion of Persia. On the surface, this reads as a simple religious proclamation. In practice, it was closer to a revolution, imposed at the point of a sword. The overwhelming majority of Persians at the time practiced Sunni Islam, the same branch of the faith that dominated most of the Islamic world, including the neighboring Ottoman Empire. Ismail's conversion campaign was not gentle persuasion. Sunni scholars who refused to abandon their faith and adopt Shia doctrine were punished, and by many historical accounts, thousands of Sunni religious leaders were executed outright, their communities terrorized into compliance or forced underground. Cities where resistance ran deepest saw entire populations pressured under threat of violence to change their religious identity, generation by generation, until Shia Islam became not merely the state's official faith, but the deeply rooted cultural identity of the land itself. This is the origin point of a religious boundary that still defines the modern Middle East. Iran's identity as the world's primary center of Shia Islam, standing in stark contrast to the overwhelmingly Sunni identity of its Arab neighbors and of Turkey, traces its roots directly back to this campaign of forced conversion launched by a teenage conqueror 500 years ago. Ismail's forces marched on Baghdad and captured it, and in a move calculated for maximum symbolic impact, they desecrated the tombs of revered Sunni religious figures buried there, an act of such deliberate provocation that it ignited fury across the Sunni world, a wound that regional memory has never fully allowed to heal. To the northeast, the newly declared Shia Empire immediately found itself locked in conflict with the Uzbek tribes, staunch defenders of Sunni orthodoxy, setting the stage for a rivalry along Persia's eastern frontier that would recur for generations. The mechanics of this forced conversion deserve closer examination because they reveal how deliberately engineered the transformation actually was. Ismail imported Shia religious scholars from established centers of Shia learning outside Persia, particularly from regions of the Arab world, where the faith already had deep institutional roots, since Persia itself lacked a sufficient existing base of Shia clergy to manage such a sweeping religious transformation on its own. These imported scholars were installed in positions of authority throughout the new empire, tasked with rooting out Sunni religious practice and replacing it, mosque by mosque, city by city, with Shia doctrine, ritual, and clergy loyal directly to the new Safavid state. Public cursing of the first three caliphs revered by Sunni Muslims became mandatory ritual practice in Friday prayers across the empire, a deliberately provocative act that Sunni communities experienced as a profound and painful religious insult, ensuring that the new sectarian divide was not merely doctrinal, but deeply, personally felt. Beyond the religious dimension, this conversion campaign carried an unmistakable political logic that historians have long recognized. By establishing a distinct Shia identity sharply differentiated from the Sunni Ottoman Empire to the west, Ismail effectively created an ideological wall reinforcing Persia's political independence, making it far more difficult for the Ottomans to ever fully absorb Persian territory through religious or cultural assimilation, the way earlier Islamic empires had sometimes blended together. In this sense, the forced conversion functioned simultaneously as sincere religious conviction and as calculated statecraft, a strategy for building a durable, distinct national identity capable of resisting the far larger and wealthier Ottoman state looming just across the border. The human cost of this transformation fell heaviest on ordinary communities caught in the transition rather than on the religious scholars and elites who feature most prominently in the surviving written record. Entire towns and villages, whose families had practiced Sunni Islam for generations without interruption, faced the wrenching choice between abandoning inherited religious tradition or risking violent reprisal, economic exclusion, and social marginalization under the new order. Many simply complied outwardly while maintaining private religious practices in secret for a generation or more, a quiet, largely undocumented resistance that historians have only partially reconstructed through scattered local records and oral tradition, passed down long after the formal conversion campaign itself had ended. The desecration of Sunni holy sites during the Baghdad campaign carried consequences that extended far beyond the immediate act of destruction. Baghdad had served for centuries as one of the most important centers of Sunni Islamic scholarship and pilgrimage in the entire Muslim world, and the deliberate targeting of revered tombs there sent an unmistakable signal throughout the wider Sunni world that this new Safavid state viewed Sunni religious tradition itself, rather than merely rival political authority, as a legitimate target for destruction. Ottoman religious scholars seized on these events as powerful propaganda, framing their own subsequent military campaigns against the Safavids not simply as territorial conflict, but as a righteous religious obligation to protect Sunni Islam from what they characterized as a heretical, destructive threat, rhetoric that would help justify decades of subsequent warfare on both sides of the widening sectarian divide. Ismail's meteoric rise inevitably drew the attention of the era's other great Islamic superpower, the Ottoman Empire, ruled at the time by Sultan Selim I, a man history remembers by the nickname the Grim, for both his military ruthlessness and his uncompromising temperament. Where Ismail had built his empire on militant Shia identity, Selim positioned himself as the great defender of Sunni orthodoxy against what Ottoman propaganda characterized as a dangerous heretical uprising to the east. The two rulers exchanged increasingly hostile letters, each escalating the rhetoric, transforming a political and territorial rivalry into something closer to holy war between two branches of the same faith. War became inevitable, and on August 23, 1514, the armies met on the plain of Calderan in what would become one of the most consequential battles in the history of the Middle East. The battle exposed a brutal technological gap. Ismail's Qizilbash cavalry fought in the traditional steppe manner, close-quarters horse archery, speed and raw courage, the same style of warfare that had won Ismail his empire in the first place. The Ottomans, by contrast, brought cannons and the disciplined musket fire of their elite Janissary infantry corps, cutting-edge gunpowder technology that the Safavid forces had never seriously invested in. Many Qizilbash warriors, driven by their near-religious devotion to Ismail, charged directly into cannon and musket fire, believing themselves spiritually protected from harm. The result was slaughter on a scale that shattered the myth of Safavid invincibility built so carefully over the previous decade. Ismail suffered a humiliating defeat, and Persia permanently lost control of eastern Anatolia to Ottoman rule. But the deeper wound was psychological. The young conqueror, who had never known defeat, who had built an entire movement around the belief that he was untouchable, watched that illusion collapse on a single battlefield. Historical accounts describe a broken man afterward. Ismail withdrew increasingly into alcohol, abandoned personal command of his armies, and never again led troops into battle for the remainder of his life until his death. The battlefield disparity at Calderan illustrates a pattern that would recur throughout Safavid history. The empire's founding military identity, rooted in the fast, mobile horse archer tradition of the Central Asian steppe, proved devastatingly effective for rapid conquest, but dangerously slow to adapt to the gunpowder revolution, transforming warfare across Europe and the Ottoman world during this exact period. Selim's Janissary Corps represented one of the most professionally drilled standing infantry forces on the planet at the time, equipped with matchlock muskets and supported by field artillery positioned behind defensive wagon barricades, a tactical system the Ottomans had refined over decades of European campaigning. Ismail's cavalry, brave beyond question, simply had no answer to concentrated volley fire delivered from a fortified position, a lesson that cost tens of thousands of Qizilbash lives and would force the next generation of Safavid rulers to fundamentally rethink how Persia fought its wars. Selim's own motivations extended beyond pure religious rivalry. Ottoman intelligence had grown increasingly alarmed by reports that Ismail's Shia missionaries were actively working to convert segments of the Ottoman Empire's own eastern Anatolian population, effectively exporting the same religious revolution that had already transformed Persia directly into Ottoman territory. From Istanbul's perspective, Calderan represented not merely a border conflict, but a preemptive strike against a genuine internal security threat, a rival ideology spreading dangerously close to the Ottoman heartland itself. Context that helps explain why Selim pursued the confrontation with such uncompromising, total commitment rather than treating it as an ordinary territorial dispute. The aftermath of Calderan also reshaped the internal balance of power within the Safavid state in ways that outlasted Ismail's own reign by decades. With their founder's aura of invincibility permanently shattered, Qizilbash tribal leaders grew markedly bolder in asserting independent authority, sensing correctly that the psychological hold Ismail once exercised over his followers had weakened considerably. This shift set the stage directly for the turbulent regency period that would consume the early reign of Ismail's young son and heir, as tribal factions increasingly viewed the monarchy itself as an institution whose authority could now be challenged and contested, rather than simply obeyed without question. Exactly the kind of internal fracturing that a single catastrophic battlefield defeat can unleash within a state still young enough to lack deep institutional roots. The Battle of Calderan also reshaped how subsequent generations of Safavid military planners approached warfare against gunpowder-equipped adversaries, even though meaningful reform would take decades to fully materialize. Persian commanders who survived the battle carried with them a hard-earned, visceral understanding that raw cavalry courage, however fierce, could no longer substitute for matching an enemy's technological capabilities on the modern battlefield. This lesson would not be fully absorbed and acted upon until Shah Abbas's sweeping military reforms nearly a century later, but the seeds of that eventual transformation were planted directly in the humiliation and heavy losses suffered on the plain of Chaldiran, a defeat that haunted Safavid strategic thinking for generations afterward. When Ismail died, his son Tahmasp inherited the throne at the almost unimaginable age of 10 years old. What followed was not a smooth transfer of power, but a decade of vicious internal struggle, as the powerful Qizilbash tribal chiefs, the very warriors whose fanatical loyalty had built the empire, turned that loyalty into a weapon for controlling the child king, each faction maneuvering to dominate the throne through the boy sitting on it. Tahmasp's survival through this period stands as a remarkable political achievement in its own right. Slowly, methodically, as he grew from child to young man, he maneuvered the competing Qizilbash factions against one another, gradually stripping away their independent power and consolidating genuine royal authority in his own hands, rather than remaining a puppet for tribal warlords. His reign, spanning decades, was defined by a punishing reality: war on two fronts simultaneously. To the west, the Ottoman Empire continued pressing against Safavid territory. To the east, the Uzbeks remained a persistent threat. Facing enemies who often outmatched his forces in raw numbers or firepower, Tahmasp adopted a devastating defensive strategy known as scorched earth, deliberately destroying his own countryside's crops, farmland, and settlements in the path of an advancing enemy army, denying invaders any food or supplies to sustain their campaign deep inside Persian territory. It was warfare that punished his own people to starve his enemies, a brutal calculation that nonetheless repeatedly forced invading Ottoman armies to retreat, rather than risk starvation far from their own supply lines. In 1555, decades of exhausting conflict finally produced the Treaty of Amasya, formally establishing a border between the Ottoman and Safavid empires and bringing a fragile peace. It was the first serious pause in a rivalry that had consumed Safavid Persia since its very founding. A chance, however brief, to breathe. Tahmasp's political survival during his early years on the throne relied heavily on a strategy of calculated patience rather than direct confrontation. Rather than attempting to crush the dominant Qizilbash factions outright, while he remained too young and too weak to win such a fight, he allowed rival tribal chiefs to exhaust themselves fighting one another for control of his regency, occasionally tilting his support toward whichever faction seemed weakest at any given moment, preventing any single group from consolidating permanent dominance over the throne. Only once he reached full adulthood, with years of careful political education behind him, did he begin systematically appointing loyalists to key military and administrative positions, gradually replacing entrenched tribal power with officials who owed their position directly to the crown rather than to any competing kinship network. A slow, patient project of centralization that his father's meteoric rise had never required, but which his own more precarious inheritance made absolutely necessary for survival. The scorched earth strategy Tahmasp employed against invading Ottoman armies deserves recognition as a genuinely sophisticated piece of asymmetric warfare, one that anticipated tactics later associated with far more modern conflicts. Rather than risk his still recovering military in direct pitched battles against a numerically superior and better equipped Ottoman force, Tahmasp accepted devastating short-term damage to his own agricultural heartland as the price of denying his enemy any sustainable foothold deep inside Persian territory. Ottoman commanders repeatedly found themselves winning tactical engagements, only to be forced into humiliating retreat as their supply lines collapsed hundreds of miles from friendly territory, a pattern that repeated across multiple Ottoman invasions during Tahmasp's long reign, and ultimately proved more decisive in preserving Safavid independence than any single battlefield victory could have achieved. Tahmasp's four-decade reign, Though rarely celebrated with the same dramatic flourish as his father's meteoric rise or his eventual successor, Abbas's golden age, deserves recognition as arguably the single most important stabilizing chapter in the empire's early survival. Having inherited a kingdom shattered by military humiliation and threatened with immediate internal collapse from competing tribal factions, Tahmasp methodically rebuilt royal authority, piece by piece, over the course of decades, rather than through any single decisive stroke, ultimately handing his own successors a functioning unified state rather than the fractured, contested inheritance he himself had received as a 10-year-old boy, patient, unglamorous statecraft that made possible everything the dynasty would later achieve under Abbas. Tahmasp's later years also saw him pursue a notably more cautious and defensively minded foreign policy than either his father's relentless expansionism or his eventual successor's ambitious reconquest campaigns, a temperamental shift historians often attribute directly to the harsh lessons of his own turbulent childhood regency. Having witnessed firsthand how quickly overextended ambition and internal factional strife could nearly unravel the entire Safavid project, Tahmasp prioritized consolidation and institutional stability over further territorial conquest for much of his reign, a deliberately unglamorous strategic choice that nonetheless ensured the dynasty survived long enough to eventually produce a ruler capable of reclaiming the initiative Ismail's generation had briefly commanded. By the time Shah Abbas I came to power in 1588, the Safavid Empire was in genuine crisis, hemorrhaging territory on multiple fronts and governed by a series of weaker rulers who had failed to match Tahmasp's political skill. Abbas inherited a kingdom in decline, and his response would transform Safavid Persia into the most powerful and prosperous version of itself in its entire history. His first move revealed a rare strategic patience. Rather than fight wars on every front simultaneously, Abbas signed a humiliating treaty, ceding significant territory to the Ottomans, buying himself time and freeing his forces to focus entirely on defeating the Uzbek threat in the east first. It was a decision that damaged his pride but preserved his kingdom, prioritizing survival over short-term honor. With his eastern flank secured, Abbas turned to the internal problem that had plagued every Safavid ruler since Ismail, the unruly, often disloyal power of the Qizilbash tribal chiefs. Rather than continue managing this volatile alliance, Abbas broke it decisively, systematically stripping the Qizilbash of their military dominance. In its place, he built an entirely new fighting force called the Ghulams, soldiers drawn primarily from captured Christian boys taken from Armenia and Georgia, raised and trained from childhood, with loyalty to the Shah personally rather than to any competing tribal identity. A system that echoed similar slave soldier traditions used successfully by other Islamic empires of the era. Abbas also recognized that Persia's military had fallen dangerously behind the gunpowder revolution, reshaping warfare across Europe and the Ottoman world. He equipped his new army with tens of thousands of muskets and modern artillery, closing the very technological gap that had proven so catastrophic at Chaldiran nearly a century earlier. Armed with reformed loyal troops and modern weaponry, Abbas launched a series of triumphant campaigns, reclaiming territory lost to both the Ottomans and the Uzbeks, and restoring Safavid Persia to genuine great power status. Abbas's reforms extended well beyond the purely military sphere into the fundamental architecture of how the empire governed itself. He worked systematically to reduce his dependence on the great regional Qizilbash tribal governors, instead expanding a system of crown-controlled provinces administered directly by officials answerable to the central government in the capital, rather than to hereditary tribal leadership. This shift dramatically increased the direct revenue flowing into the royal treasury, while simultaneously reducing the political leverage that regional power brokers had traditionally held over the throne. He also proved a shrewd and pragmatic diplomat, willing to negotiate with European powers, tolerate religious minorities within his territory when it served the state's economic interests, and adapt foreign military technology and expertise wherever it strengthened his position. a flexibility his more rigid predecessors and successors alike often struggled to match, and one that historians widely credit as the defining reason his reign is remembered as the undisputed zenith of Safavid power. Abbas's personal reputation among his subjects and among foreign visitors alike combined genuine charisma with calculated theatre. He reportedly walked the streets and markets of his cities in disguise on occasion, gathering unfiltered information about how his officials actually treated ordinary people, rather than relying solely on the sanitized reports delivered by court advisors. This kind of direct, hands-on engagement with the realities of governance stood in sharp contrast to the isolated, harem-bound rulers who would follow him, and it produced a level of administrative accountability that the empire would never again fully recapture once Abbas himself was gone. A striking reminder that even the same institutional structures can produce wildly different outcomes depending entirely on the individual competence and engagement of the ruler sitting at the center of them. Abbas's economic reforms extended into infrastructure investment on a scale that transformed how goods and people moved across the empire. He commissioned extensive networks of caravanserais, fortified rest stops spaced along major trade routes, offering merchants secure lodging, water, and protection from bandits, dramatically improving the safety and efficiency of overland commerce throughout Persian territory. Combined with his currency reforms aimed at stabilizing the value of Safavid coinage and his active courting of foreign merchants through favorable trading terms, these infrastructure investments helped generate the kind of sustained economic growth that funded both his military reforms and the extraordinary architectural transformation of Isfahan, a rare example of a ruler successfully coordinating military, economic, and cultural policy into a single coherent, mutually reinforcing vision for the empire's future. Abbas's treatment of the defeated Uzbek and Ottoman territories he reclaimed also revealed a pragmatic approach to consolidating new gains rather than simply celebrating military victory for its own sake. Rather than imposing the kind of harsh, punitive administration that might breed lasting local resentment and future rebellion, he generally sought to integrate newly recovered provinces through a careful balance of firm military garrison presence and reasonably fair local governance, recognizing that durable control over reclaimed territory required more than battlefield success alone. This same pragmatic instinct extended to his treatment of defeated enemy soldiers, many of whom were offered the opportunity to enter Safavid service rather than facing execution or exile, further strengthening his reformed military with experienced fighters who might otherwise have remained a lingering source of instability along the empire's newly secured borders. In 1598, an unusual pair of visitors arrived at the Persian court, the Shirley brothers, English adventurers whose presence would trigger one of history's more unexpected diplomatic and military partnerships. Sir Anthony Shirley and his brother Robert brought with them European military expertise, offering to help modernize Safavid artillery and infantry according to the latest continental standards, knowledge Shah Abbas eagerly absorbed as part of his broader military reform program. Robert Shirley, in particular, became deeply embedded in Persian court life, eventually serving as an ambassador representing Safavid interests in the courts of Europe, tasked with the delicate diplomatic mission of finding European allies willing to pressure the Ottoman Empire from the west, while Persia pressed from the east, a classic strategy of squeezing a shared enemy between two fronts. This European connection soon collided with another major power jostling for position in the region, Portugal, which controlled the critically important Strait of Hormuz, the narrow maritime choke point controlling access to the Persian Gulf, and, by extension, enormous volumes of regional trade. Abbas found an unlikely ally in the English East India Company, whose commercial interests aligned neatly with Persia's desire to break Portuguese control of the strait. In 1622, Safavid land forces combined with English naval power in a coordinated assault that successfully expelled the Portuguese from Hormuz entirely. The victory opened Persian trade directly to European maritime commerce for the first time on Safavid terms, bypassing centuries of overland caravan routes and channeling a significant new flow of European silver and wealth directly into the Safavid economy, a partnership between a Central Asian Islamic empire and a rising English trading company that would have seemed almost unthinkable a generation earlier. The Hormuz campaign also marked a notable milestone in the broader story of European commercial expansion into Asia, since it demonstrated how effectively a well-resourced trading company, like the English East India Company, could translate purely commercial interests into direct military intervention when the strategic and financial stakes justified the risk. For the Safavids, the alliance delivered exactly what Abbas had hoped for: a decisive end to Portuguese control over a critical trade choke point. But it also quietly established a template for European commercial powers inserting themselves directly into regional power struggles across Asia, a pattern that would recur with far more destructive consequences for local sovereignty in the centuries that followed, long after the Safavid dynasty itself had faded from power. Sir Anthony Shirley's own account of his time at the Persian court, published back in England, generated considerable public fascination with Persia among European readers, feeding a broader early modern European curiosity about the wealth, sophistication, and exotic splendor of the Safavid state that stood in sharp contrast to the more common European perception of the Ottoman Empire as primarily a military threat. This wave of published travel accounts and diplomatic reports helped establish Safavid Persia in the European imagination as a distinct and potentially valuable partner, rather than simply another unfamiliar Islamic power, laying informal cultural groundwork that would support generations of subsequent European trade and diplomatic engagement with Persia long after the Shirley brothers themselves had passed from the scene. The broader strategic calculation underlying Abbas's embrace of European military expertise and commercial partnership reflected a clear-eyed understanding that the Safavid Empire, for all its regional power, could not match the Ottoman Empire's resources through purely internal reform alone. By actively cultivating relationships with European powers who shared an interest in checking Ottoman expansion, whether for religious, commercial, or purely strategic reasons, Abbas effectively built an informal counterweight to Ottoman dominance that operated well beyond the immediate battlefield, extending Safavid influence into diplomatic and commercial networks stretching from London to Amsterdam to Lisbon, a level of sophisticated international engagement that few contemporary rulers outside Europe itself managed to achieve with comparable success during this period. Robert Shirley's diplomatic career illustrates just how seriously Abbas took the project of positioning Persia within a genuinely global geopolitical chessboard, rather than treating the empire as a purely regional power confined to its immediate neighborhood. Shirley traveled through the courts of Spain, Italy, and England, presenting himself in flamboyant Persian dress that scandalized and fascinated European nobility in equal measure, actively lobbying European monarchs to view the Safavid state as a natural ally against shared Ottoman hostility. While these diplomatic overtures never produced the grand anti-Ottoman coalition Abbas ultimately hoped for, they succeeded in something arguably more valuable in the long run, establishing Persia as a recognized, sophisticated player within the emerging network of early modern global diplomacy and trade, known by name in royal courts, thousands of miles from Isfahan. In 1598, Shah Abbas made a decision that would define his legacy as much as any military victory. He relocated the Safavid capital to Isfahan, partly a strategic choice to move the seat of government farther from the vulnerable, contested Ottoman frontier, and partly a declaration of imperial ambition matched by architectural vision. What Abbas built in Isfahan was staggering in scale and sophistication. Engineers designed an entire planned metropolis, complete with advanced water systems, broad tree-lined boulevards, and elegant bridges spanning the Zayandeh River, several of which remain celebrated architectural landmarks to this day. At the city's heart, Abbas commissioned the construction of Naqsh Jahan Square, one of the largest public squares ever built anywhere on Earth, larger by most measurements than Moscow's famous Red Square, surrounded by mosques, a royal palace, and a sprawling bazaar, all unified by a coherent architectural vision unlike anything else being attempted in the world at that time. Economically, Abbas pursued an equally ambitious strategy. He forcibly relocated an entire community of Armenian merchants to a new district of Isfahan called New Julfa, leveraging their existing international trade networks to give the Safavid state direct control over the enormously lucrative export of Persian silk, at the time one of the most highly prized luxury commodities in European markets, commanding extraordinary prices from London to Amsterdam. The city that emerged from all of this ambition earned an enduring nickname among visitors and residents alike: Isfahan, Nesfi Jahan, Isfahan, half the world, a boast reflecting genuine cosmopolitan reality. The city's famous coffee houses became gathering places for poets, artists and scholars drawn from across the known world, while foreign ambassadors, arriving in Isfahan for the first time, frequently described a city that rivaled, and by some accounts surpassed, the great capitals of contemporary Europe in both beauty and sophistication. The relocation of the Armenian merchant community to New Julfa deserves particular attention because it reveals the calculated, almost ruthless pragmatism underlying Abbasi's economic vision. These Armenian traders were not simply invited to Isfahan, they were forcibly deported from their original homeland, uprooted from communities their families had inhabited for generations, and resettled specifically because their existing commercial networks, stretching into Europe, India, and the Ottoman world, gave the Safavid state unmatched access to international silk markets. In exchange for this forced relocation, Abbas granted the Armenian community in New Julfa unusual religious freedom and considerable commercial autonomy, allowing them to build their own churches and manage their own affairs, a calculated bargain that transformed a displaced minority into one of the most economically vital communities in the entire empire, generating enormous royal revenue through silk exports that funded much of the very architectural grandeur rising around them. The architectural achievements of Isfahan under Abbas reflected a deliberate, unified aesthetic vision rather than piecemeal construction, with royal architects coordinating the placement of mosques, palaces, and marketplaces around Naqsh Jahan Square to create sweeping sightlines and a genuine sense of theatrical grandeur meant to overwhelm visitors approaching from any direction. The turquoise and cobalt tilework covering the domes of the Shah Mosque and the Sheikh Lotfolla Mosque represented the absolute technical peak of Persian ceramic artistry, employing techniques so labor-intensive and specialized that master craftsmen spent years training simply to execute the intricate geometric and floral patterns still considered among the finest surviving examples of Islamic architectural decoration anywhere in the world today. Beyond its religious and royal buildings, Isfahan under Abbas developed a thriving commercial infrastructure centered on its grand covered bazaar, one of the longest and most elaborate marketplace complexes anywhere in the pre-modern world, stretching for miles and connecting directly to Naqsh Jahan Square itself. Merchants trading in silk, carpets, spices, and metalwork operated within a carefully organized system of specialized sections, each dedicated to particular trades and goods, creating an economic engine that generated enormous customs revenue for the crown, while simultaneously showcasing Persian craftsmanship to visiting merchants and diplomats from across Asia and Europe, reinforcing at every turn the city's carefully cultivated image as a genuine global crossroads, rather than merely a regional capital. Isfahan's transformation under Abbas also reflected a deliberate strategy of using architectural and urban grandeur as a tool of political legitimacy, projecting an image of unshakable imperial permanence to both domestic subjects and foreign visitors alike. The sheer scale and coordinated planning behind projects like Naqsh Jahan Square communicated a message that went beyond simple aesthetic ambition. This was a dynasty confident enough in its own future to invest staggering resources in monuments clearly designed to endure for centuries, a calculated statement of imperial permanence that stood in sharp, almost tragic contrast to the actual fragility that would come to define the dynasty's fortunes barely a century after Abbas's own death. For all his genuine brilliance as a military reformer, urban planner and diplomat, Shah Abbas carried within him a darkness that would ultimately poison his own dynasty from within, a consuming paranoia that his own sons were plotting to seize his throne before he was ready to relinquish it. In 1615, this paranoia erupted into horrifying action. In a fit of sudden rage triggered by suspicion of disloyalty, Abbas ordered the execution of his own eldest son and heir, Safi Mirza, eliminating in a single violent decision the very continuity of leadership he claimed to be protecting. It was not an isolated incident. 2 more of his sons were subjected to an even crueler fate, blinded with hot iron, a punishment specifically designed to permanently disqualify them from ever claiming the throne, since Persian tradition held that a physically blemished ruler could not legitimately reign. Out of this atmosphere of paranoid violence emerged a formal institutional practice that would define and ultimately cripple the rest of the Safavid dynasty. Princes destined for the throne were raised almost entirely within the confines of the royal harem, isolated from military training, court politics, and practical governance, surrounded instead by women and eunuchs rather than generals, advisors, and statesmen. The political logic behind this system was, in its own twisted way, coherent. A prince who never developed independent political or military relationships could never build the kind of power base needed to threaten his father's throne. But the long-term cost proved catastrophic. Successive generations of Safavid heirs emerged from the harem system as young men with no meaningful experience commanding armies, negotiating with foreign powers, or managing the day-to-day business of running an empire. Many succumbed instead to alcoholism and the isolated pleasures of harem life, arriving on the throne fundamentally unprepared for the immense responsibilities suddenly placed on their shoulders, a slow-motion self-inflicted wound that would take generations to fully manifest, but which planted the seeds of the dynasty's eventual collapse. There is a bitter irony at the heart of this entire chapter of Safavid history worth sitting with. Shah Abbas, the very ruler whose military reforms, economic vision, and diplomatic sophistication built the empire's greatest era of strength, simultaneously engineered the institutional mechanism that would systematically weaken every ruler who followed him. His genuine achievements as a builder and reformer sit alongside a legacy of calculated cruelty toward his own children that historians still find difficult to fully reconcile. Contemporary court chronicles describe Abbas in his final years as increasingly isolated and reportedly haunted by guilt over the execution of his eldest son. Surrounded by grandchildren he had personally ensured would never develop the skills needed to rule effectively. A king who secured his own throne so completely that he left almost nothing but weakness behind him for the family meant to inherit it. Comparative historians studying dynastic succession across different empires often point to the Safavid harem system as a particularly stark cautionary example of a broader pattern. Rulers who eliminate every plausible internal rival in the name of stability frequently succeed only in eliminating the pool of competent successors along with them. The Ottoman Empire developed its own version of this same dilemma through fratricidal succession practices, and various Chinese dynasties wrestled with strikingly similar tensions between protecting a reigning emperor from palace intrigue and ensuring his heirs received the practical training needed to eventually govern effectively. What made the Safavid version so uniquely destructive was the sheer completeness of the isolation involved. Princes raised entirely within the harem's walls typically encountered the outside machinery of the empire they were meant to rule for the very first time on the day they actually inherited it. The physical geography of the royal harem itself reinforced this isolation in ways that went beyond simple policy or tradition. Confined within heavily guarded palace walls, surrounded almost exclusively by women, eunuchs, and a small circle of trusted attendants, young Safavid princes had virtually no exposure to the ordinary texture of life beyond the court. no experience negotiating with foreign merchants, commanding soldiers under real battlefield pressure, or managing the countless small administrative decisions that collectively constitute effective governance. When such a prince finally emerged to claim the throne, often only after his father's death forced an abrupt, unprepared transition, he arrived not merely lacking specific skills, but lacking the accumulated intuition and judgment that only direct, lived experience of responsibility can build over time. Historical records suggest that Abbas himself may have grown aware, at least partially, of the corrosive long-term consequences his harem policy was likely to produce, yet he never meaningfully reformed the system during his own lifetime, seemingly trapped by the very paranoia that had created it in the first place. Court chroniclers describe an aging Abbas expressing occasional regret over the execution of Safi Mirza specifically, reportedly commissioning portraits and memorials of his lost heir, even as he maintained the broader isolating structure that continued shaping the development of his remaining sons and grandsons. This apparent contradiction between private remorse and continued institutional practice illustrates just how difficult it can be for even a genuinely brilliant ruler to escape the logic of a system built initially out of fear, once that system has become deeply embedded in the practical mechanics of how a dynasty protects its own continuity. Even at the height of Safavid power under Abbas and his immediate successors, peace remained elusive. Conflict over the strategically vital city of Kandahar dragged Safavid forces into repeated confrontation with the Mughal Empire to the east, a rival Islamic power controlling much of the Indian subcontinent and equally determined to claim the region for itself. The sheer physical toll of Safavid military strategy deserves particular attention. Armies were routinely required to march staggering distances, from the mountainous Caucasus frontier in the northwest all the way to the arid deserts of Afghanistan in the southeast. Campaign seasons that exhausted soldiers, horses, and supply lines alike, year after year, decade after decade, with barely any interruption. This was an empire perpetually mobilized for war on multiple simultaneous fronts, an exhausting posture that no amount of military reform could fully sustain indefinitely. In 1638, Safavid forces achieved a significant symbolic victory, recapturing Baghdad from Ottoman control. This triumph led, in 1639, to the Treaty of Zuhab, formally ending a century and a half of intermittent warfare between the Safavid and Ottoman empires. On paper, this represented a genuine diplomatic achievement, finally closing the conflict that had defined Safavid foreign policy since Chaldiran. In practice, the long peace with the Ottomans proved to be a double-edged sword. Without an active existential threat pressing against the western frontier, successive Safavid rulers grew increasingly complacent, allowing military readiness, training standards, and equipment modernization to atrophy. The empire had survived a century and a half of brutal warfare, only to discover that the psychological and institutional cost of maintaining such a permanently militarized state for so long had hollowed out its economy and its governing institutions from the inside, even as the guns finally fell silent along its most contested border. The Kandahar conflicts with the Mughal Empire deserve attention as their own distinct chapter of exhausting, largely inconclusive warfare. The city changed hands multiple times across several decades, each side investing enormous resources in campaigns that produced only temporary gains before the strategic balance shifted once again. Soldiers who had already endured brutal campaigning against the Ottomans and Uzbeks found themselves redirected toward yet another distant frontier, marching across some of the most inhospitable terrain in the region, campaign after campaign, with little lasting strategic benefit to show for the tremendous human and financial cost. This pattern of perpetual low-yield warfare on multiple fronts simultaneously represents one of the most underappreciated structural weaknesses running beneath the surface of Safavid power throughout its entire two-century existence. It is worth pausing to consider the sheer financial burden that this permanent state of multi-front military mobilization placed on the Safavid treasury across generations. maintaining standing forces capable of responding simultaneously to threats from the Ottomans in the west, the Uzbeks in the northeast, and the Mughals in the southeast, required a level of sustained military spending that few empires of the era could comfortably absorb even during periods of genuine prosperity. When the economic foundations of the empire began weakening in the following century, this same structural commitment to permanent multi-front defense readiness, rather than adapting or contracting to match diminished resources, continued consuming funds the state increasingly could not spare, accelerating rather than cushioning the broader economic decline already underway. The soldiers who bore the physical burden of this permanent mobilization deserve their own recognition within this story. Many spent the majority of their adult lives on campaign, separated from families and settled communities for months or years at a stretch, marching between fronts that could be 1,000 miles apart in punishing terrain ranging from frozen mountain passes to scorching desert plains. Chronic underpayment, a problem that worsened significantly as the empire's finances deteriorated in later decades, compounded this hardship considerably, breeding resentment and declining morale among precisely the fighting forces the empire depended on most to hold its sprawling, difficult-to-defend borders together against enemies pressing from every direction simultaneously. The Ghulam soldiers Abbas had introduced decades earlier, initially prized for their unwavering personal loyalty to the crown rather than to competing tribal factions, gradually developed their own institutional interests and internal politics as the decades wore on, a natural evolution that echoed, in a somewhat different form, the same cycle of initially loyal military institutions that had plagued the Qizilbash generations earlier. By the time the empire's later, weaker rulers inherited this military apparatus, its officer corps had accumulated its own entrenched interests and factional rivalries, further complicating any efforts at meaningful reform precisely when such reform was needed most urgently to address the mounting external and internal pressures converging on the state. The consequences of the harem system, first institutionalized under Shah Abbas's paranoid later years, became painfully visible in the reigns that followed. Shah Safi, grandson of Abbas, ascended the throne having been raised entirely within the isolated confines of the royal harem, with no meaningful military or administrative training whatsoever. His reign began, tellingly, with the execution of several of the empire's most capable and experienced military commanders, driven by exactly the same paranoid suspicion that had consumed his grandfather, but now wielded by a ruler who lacked the strategic brilliance to balance that paranoia with genuine competence. Subsequent Safavid rulers followed an increasingly troubling pattern, drifting further from active governance and military leadership, absorbed instead in the isolated pleasures of harem life, alcohol, and court luxury, while the actual machinery of running an empire fell by default to whoever could seize influence closest to the throne. Real power increasingly shifted into the hands of court eunuchs and the queen mothers of the isolated young shahs, figures operating largely behind the scenes, frequently more concerned with court intrigue and personal advancement than with the health of the wider empire. Corruption spread through the administrative system as provincial governorships were openly sold to the highest bidder rather than awarded on merit or competence, steadily eroding the quality and loyalty of local governance across Safavid territory. By this point, the military that had once conquered and defended one of the great empires of the Islamic world found itself in a state of genuine crisis. Poorly trained, equipped with increasingly outdated weapons compared to European and Ottoman standards, and frequently left unpaid for months at a stretch, an army in name only, propped up by the memory of past glories rather than any current capability. Foreign visitors to the Safavid court during this period of decline left behind vivid, often startled accounts of the dysfunction they witnessed firsthand. European diplomats and merchants describe royal audiences where the Shah appeared visibly intoxicated, state business conducted through layers of court intermediaries rather than direct royal decision-making, and a palpable sense among foreign observers that genuine authority had drained away from the throne itself into a shifting cast of court insiders whose loyalties and competence varied enormously from one year to the next. Where Shah Abbas had once personally received foreign ambassadors with sharp, informed questions about European politics and technology, his successors increasingly delegated such encounters entirely, a small but telling symptom of just how completely the harem system had severed Safavid rulers from the practical business of governing a vast and complicated empire. The shifting balance of court power toward eunuchs and royal mothers during this period also reflected deeper structural dynamics within the harem system itself. Eunuchs, unable to father their own dynastic claims to the throne, were often trusted with sensitive administrative responsibilities precisely because they posed no personal threat of founding a rival succession. But this same logic meant that critical decisions increasingly rested with individuals whose entire careers had been built inside the insulated world of the palace, with little direct experience of military command, provincial administration, or the practical challenges facing ordinary subjects living far from Isfahan's marble courtyards. Distance from reality, layered on top of distance from real accountability, compounded steadily with each passing generation of weak, harem-raised rulers. The sale of provincial governorships to the highest bidder, a practice that spread widely during this period of institutional decline, deserves particular attention as both a symptom and an accelerant of the broader crisis. Officials who purchased their positions rather than earning them through demonstrated competence naturally sought to recoup their investment and often generate additional personal profit through aggressive extraction of wealth from the populations under their administration, frequently through taxation that far exceeded official rates, or through outright extortion backed by whatever local military force the governor could muster. This created a vicious cycle in which the very people meant to represent central authority in the provinces instead actively undermined popular trust in that authority, further eroding the loyalty and stability the empire desperately needed, precisely as external pressures were beginning to mount. Foreign trading companies operating in Persia during this period of decline documented a marked deterioration in the reliability of official Safavid administration compared to accounts from earlier generations. Contracts once honored consistently under Shah Abbas's more rigorous oversight increasingly became subject to arbitrary renegotiation, bribery, and inconsistent enforcement as local officials pursued short-term personal gain over the empire's longer-term commercial reputation, a shift that gradually eroded the very foreign trade relationships that had once been such a vital source of Safavid prosperity and international prestige. Beyond the internal political rot, the Safavid Empire faced a devastating external economic shock during the 17th century, a global silver crisis that rippled through trade networks stretching from the mines of the New World all the way to the markets of Isfahan, directly undermining the monetary foundation of the Safavid economy. Compounding this crisis was a fundamental shift in global trade patterns. Dutch and English merchant companies increasingly favored maritime routes around Africa to reach Asian markets directly by sea, rather than relying on the traditional overland caravan routes that had once funneled enormous wealth through Persian territory in the form of transit taxes and trade tariffs. As European sea trade expanded, Persia's overland silk and spice trade routes, once a primary engine of Safavid prosperity, saw their relative importance steadily decline. Faced with a shrinking tax base and a treasury under mounting strain, the Safavid government made a series of decisions that only deepened the economic crisis rather than resolving it. Rather than reforming an increasingly corrupt and inefficient administrative system, officials responded by dramatically increasing tax burdens on ordinary farmers and local merchants, squeezing the very population whose productive economic activity the empire desperately needed to sustain itself. The results proved predictably devastating. Overtaxed farmers abandoned their land in growing numbers, agricultural production declined sharply across the empire, and widespread poverty spread through the countryside. An empire that had once commanded staggering wealth through its control of the silk trade and its strategic position along major trade routes now found itself financially hollowed out, starved of the very resources needed to maintain the army, pay its officials, and project the kind of power that had once made Safavid Persia one of the wonders of the world. The silver crisis itself originated far beyond Persia's borders, rooted in complex shifts in Spanish-American mining output and European monetary policy that Safavid officials had no meaningful ability to influence or even fully understand at the time. This exposed a structural vulnerability inherent in an economy that had grown heavily dependent on international bullion flows and long-distance luxury trade rather than a diversified, self-sufficient, domestic productive base. When European demand patterns shifted and new maritime trade routes bypassed traditional overland networks, Safavid Persia discovered just how exposed its prosperity had always been to forces operating entirely outside its own borders and beyond any single ruler's control. A lesson that arrived far too late to meaningfully reform an economic system already deeply entrenched in old patterns of trade and taxation. The Dutch East India Company's growing dominance over maritime trade routes through the Persian Gulf compounded this crisis in ways Safavid officials struggled to fully counter. Where Portuguese control of Hormuz had at least kept European commercial power contained to a single, expellable choke point, the Dutch, and later the English, established far more extensive and diversified trading networks throughout the region, gradually diverting commercial traffic and customs revenue away from traditional Safavid-controlled overland routes toward maritime channels. The empire had far less capacity to tax or regulate effectively. What had once been a source of tremendous strength, Persia's central position along ancient trade routes connecting Asia and Europe, steadily eroded in relative value as the entire structure of global commerce reorganized itself around ocean shipping, a transformation Safavid economic policy never managed to adapt to in any sustained or coherent way. Rural communities bore the brunt of the resulting fiscal squeeze in ways that rippled outward through the entire economy. As tax collectors, pressured by a central government desperate for revenue, extracted increasingly unsustainable payments from farming villages, many rural families abandoned agricultural land entirely, migrating towards cities in search of alternative livelihoods or simply falling into destitution. This exodus from productive farmland further reduced the tax base available to the state, creating a downward spiral in which each round of increased taxation produced diminishing returns while inflicting mounting human suffering. A slow-motion economic catastrophe unfolding largely outside the walls of Isfahan's palaces, invisible to a royal court, increasingly disconnected from conditions in the wider empire it nominally governed. The compounding effect of monetary crisis, shifting global trade patterns, and administrative corruption created a downward economic spiral that no single reform could have easily reversed, even under more capable leadership. Each individual problem might, in isolation, have been manageable through careful policy adjustment, but their simultaneous convergence during the same critical decades overwhelmed an administrative system already weakened by generations of harem-raised, disengaged rulers with neither the training nor the inclination to pursue the kind of sustained, difficult economic reform genuinely needed to address root causes rather than merely extracting more revenue from an already exhausted population. The reign of Shah Sultan Hussein, beginning in 1694, brought to the throne perhaps the weakest and most religiously extreme ruler in the entire history of the Safavid dynasty, a man whose devout piety translated, in practice, into disastrous governance driven by clerical extremism rather than sound statecraft. Under Hussein's reign, the influence of hardline religious clerics reached unprecedented heights, none more powerful than Muhammad Baqir Majlisi, a cleric whose uncompromising interpretation of Shia orthodoxy shaped state policy in increasingly extreme directions. Strict new laws banned alcohol, prohibited music, and imposed harsh restrictions and active persecution against religious minorities across the empire. Zoroastrians, Christians, Jews, and, most consequentially, Sunni Muslims living within Safavid territory. This intensified religious persecution fell especially hard on the Afghan population living in the Kandahar region, communities that had practiced Sunni Islam for generations and now found themselves treated as second-class subjects within their own homeland, systematically discriminated against by a central government in distant Isfahan that viewed their faith itself as a threat to be suppressed rather than a population to be governed fairly. The consequences of this religious extremism proved catastrophic for imperial unity. Border populations, particularly the Afghans, increasingly saw no reason for loyalty to a distant capital that actively persecuted their religious identity and communities. What had once been, under Shah Abbas, a genuinely multicultural and relatively tolerant empire, one that had welcomed Armenian merchants and employed Christian soldiers at the highest levels of military command, had transformed, within just a few generations, into a narrow, intolerant state, actively manufacturing enemies out of its own subjects along its most vulnerable frontiers. Shah Sultan Hussein's personal piety was, by most contemporary accounts, entirely genuine rather than calculated political theatre, which made the resulting damage all the more tragic in its own way. He reportedly spent enormous amounts of time in religious devotion and ceremony while state affairs languished, delegating governance almost entirely to majlisi and other hardline clerical advisors who possessed deep theological knowledge but little practical understanding of statecraft, military strategy, or the delicate balance of tolerance required to hold together a multi-ethnic, multi-religious empire. It is a pattern that recurs throughout history in different forms. A ruler's genuine personal virtue applied without wisdom or restraint to the machinery of state, proving just as destructive to an empire as outright corruption or cruelty might have been. Majlisi's influence extended well beyond simple policy advice into the fundamental character of Safavid religious and cultural life during this period. His extensive theological writings, still studied within Shia scholarship today, promoted an increasingly rigid, literalist interpretation of religious law that left little room for the kind of pragmatic religious tolerance earlier Safavid rulers had employed when it served state interests. Where Shah Abbas had calculated that religious flexibility toward Armenian Christians and other minorities served Persia's broader economic and diplomatic goals, the clerical establishment surrounding Shah Sultan Hussein increasingly treated any such tolerance as a dangerous compromise of religious principle, systematically dismantling exactly the kind of pragmatic multiculturalism that had once made the empire so economically and diplomatically dynamic. The persecution of religious minorities under this clerical-dominated administration extended well beyond the empire's Sunni Afghan subjects to affect Christian, Jewish, and Zoroastrian communities that had, in many cases, lived within Persian territory for centuries under considerably more tolerant conditions during earlier Safavid reigns. Forced conversions, punitive taxation targeting non-Shia populations specifically, and periodic waves of officially sanctioned harassment created deep, lasting grievances among communities that had previously found ways to coexist productively within the broader Safavid economic and social fabric. This erosion of the empire's historic religious pluralism represented not merely a moral failing, but a genuine strategic self-inflicted wound, squandering exactly the kind of diverse economic talent and cross-border commercial connections that skilled minority communities like the Armenians had once provided so valuably to the state. Shah Sultan Hussein's reign coincided with, and in significant part directly caused, a broader deterioration in the empire's relationship with virtually every significant minority and border community within its territory, not merely the Afghans of Kandahar. Reports from foreign observers stationed in Persia during these final Safavid decades describe a pervasive sense of grievance and alienation spreading among communities that had once found ways to prosper and coexist productively under the more pragmatic religious policies of earlier rulers. A slow accumulation of resentment across the empire's diverse population that would prove devastatingly relevant once open rebellion finally erupted along the empire's periphery. In the Kandahar region, years of religious persecution and administrative neglect finally produced open rebellion. Mirwais Hotak, a tribal leader of the Ghilzai Afghan people, successfully outmaneuvered the local Safavid administration and, in 1709, declared outright independence from central Persian rule, establishing the first serious crack in what had once seemed an unshakable imperial structure. The Safavid response revealed just how thoroughly the empire's military had decayed. Forces dispatched to crush the rebellion were repeatedly and humiliatingly defeated by Afghan tribal fighters, exposing a Persian army that had grown weak, poorly trained, and badly led. A shocking reversal for a military that had once dominated the region under Shah Abbas, barely a century earlier. Following Mirwais Hotak's death, leadership of the growing Afghan rebellion passed to his son Mahmud Hotak, a far more ambitious commander who made a decision that would ultimately doom the entire Safavid dynasty. Rather than simply defending Afghan independence in the periphery, Mahmud resolved to strike directly at the heart of the empire itself, launching an invasion aimed squarely at the Safavid capital. What followed defied every reasonable military expectation. Mahmud's Afghan forces numbered barely 20,000 men, a fraction of the manpower the Safavid Empire could theoretically field. Yet these fighters possessed a fierce discipline and battlefield courage that the decayed, demoralized Safavid military simply could not match. At the Battle of Gulnabad in 1722, a much larger Safavid army, outnumbering the Afghans by more than 2-1 and equipped with modern artillery, was routed and scattered in humiliating disarray, an outcome that stunned observers across the region and left the road to Isfahan essentially undefended. The scale of this military collapse becomes even more striking when set against the empire's own defensive advantages on paper. Safavid forces at Gulnabad possessed cannons the Afghans lacked entirely, fought on ground close to their own capital with short supply lines, and could theoretically call on reserves the invaders had no equivalent access to. Yet poor leadership, badly coordinated maneuvering, and troops who had not seen genuine combat readiness in a generation combined to turn every one of these advantages into wasted potential. Contemporary accounts describe Safavid cavalry breaking formation and fleeing the field before the battle had even been meaningfully decided, a collapse in morale and discipline that reflected years of neglect finally arriving all at once, on the one day it mattered most. News of the defeat at Gulnabad spread through Isfahan with devastating speed, triggering scenes of panic among a population that had, for generations, simply assumed the capital itself stood permanently beyond the reach of any serious military threat. Court officials scrambled to organize some form of emergency defense, but decades of administrative decay meant there was no functioning system in place for rapidly mobilizing additional troops, securing adequate food reserves for a prolonged siege, or even reaching clear, decisive decisions about strategy at the highest levels of government. The very qualities that had allowed the empire to drift into such profound institutional weakness in the first place, indecisive leadership, fragmented authority, and a court more accustomed to internal intrigue than external crisis management, proved just as crippling in this moment of genuine existential emergency as they had been in the years of gradual peacetime decline that preceded it. Mirwais Hotak's original grievances against Safavid rule, which eventually grew into his son's far more ambitious campaign of conquest, had initially centered on far more modest complaints: excessive taxation imposed on Kandahar's Afghan population, religious discrimination against their Sunni faith, and the appointment of corrupt, often brutally exploitative Safavid governors with little regard for local welfare or customary rights. What began as a regional grievance movement seeking better treatment within the existing imperial system transformed, through a combination of Safavid military incompetence and growing Afghan confidence following repeated victories, into something far more consequential: a full-scale war of conquest aimed at replacing the empire's central authority altogether rather than merely reforming it from within. The transformation of Mahmud Hotak from regional rebel leader to genuine imperial conqueror also reflected shrewd political calculation beyond pure military ambition. As Afghan forces racked up victory after victory against demoralized Safavid opposition, Mahmud increasingly positioned his campaign not merely as a tribal uprising, but as a legitimate response to decades of misrule emanating from Isfahan, actively courting support from other groups across Persia who had grown disillusioned with the corruption, religious persecution, and administrative dysfunction characterizing the final years of Safavid governance. A political framing that helped his relatively small invading force find sympathizers and even active collaborators well beyond the Afghan homeland from which his rebellion had originally sprung. Rather than attempting a costly direct assault against Isfahan's substantial walls, Mahmud Hotak chose a slower, crueler strategy, a siege designed to cut off the capital's water and food supplies entirely, gradually strangling the city into submission rather than storming it by force. Inside Isfahan, a population of nearly 600,000 people descended rapidly into desperation and terror. Contemporary accounts from witnesses on the ground describe food prices rising to staggering, almost incomprehensible multiples of their normal cost within just weeks of the siege beginning, as the city's stored provisions dwindled toward nothing. As the siege dragged on, starving residents turned first to eating horses and camels, then dogs, cats, and rats, exhausting every conventional source of food within the city's walls. Eventually, the siege descended into history's darkest territory. Documented accounts describe residents dying in the streets from starvation, while some survivors, driven past the edge of ordinary human endurance, resorted to consuming the flesh of the dead, including, according to surviving records, that of deceased children. Desperate for warmth during the brutal winter months with fuel supplies as exhausted as food stores, residents began burning their own furniture and even the wooden doors of their homes simply to survive the cold. On October 23, 1722, the siege reached its final, devastating conclusion. Shah Sultan Hussein, dressed in black mourning robes, walked out from his palace and personally presented his royal crown to Mahmud Hotak, weeping as he formally surrendered an empire that had once stretched from the Caucasus to the Indian frontier, an act of total capitulation marking the practical end of over 2 centuries of Safavid imperial power, even as remnants of the dynasty would technically cling to fragments of legitimacy for a while longer. The written testimonies left behind by foreign observers trapped inside Isfahan during the siege remain some of the most harrowing documents in the historical record of the era. Dutch East India Company representatives stationed in the city recorded detailed, methodical accounts of the collapse, grain prices, mortality patterns, and the gradual breakdown of civic order, providing modern historians with an unusually precise window into exactly how a great imperial capital starved to death over the course of several agonizing months. These same accounts describe a royal court that remained astonishingly passive throughout much of the siege, failing to organize effective relief efforts, break out militarily, or negotiate meaningful terms until conditions inside the city had already deteriorated past any possibility of recovery. A final, devastating illustration of exactly the kind of paralyzed leadership that decades of harem isolation and clerical distraction had produced. Beyond the immediate human tragedy, the siege of Isfahan carried enormous symbolic weight across the wider Islamic world and beyond, marking the sudden, shocking fall of a city that had spent over a century as a byword for imperial magnificence and prosperity. News of the siege and its horrific final months spread through diplomatic and merchant networks stretching from Amsterdam to Delhi, prompting genuine astonishment that a capital so recently celebrated as half the world could collapse so completely, so quickly, and with such catastrophic human cost. For contemporaries watching from neighboring empires, the fall of Isfahan became a cautionary tale in its own right, cited for generations afterward as a stark warning about what happens when internal institutional rot goes unaddressed for too long, no matter how magnificent an empire's outward architecture and wealth might still appear to the casual observer right up until the very end. The choice of siege over direct assault while ultimately catastrophic for Isfahan's population, reflected sound military calculation on Mahmud Hotak's part, given the resources available to him. His forces, though disciplined and battle-tested, lacked the siege artillery and specialized equipment that a direct assault against Isfahan's substantial fortifications would have required, and a failed attack against a still-defended capital risked squandering the momentum his smaller army had built through its stunning victory at Gulnabad. Starvation, however horrific in its human cost, offered a lower-risk path to the same ultimate objective, and it succeeded precisely because the Safavid court proved incapable of organizing any coordinated relief effort, whether military or diplomatic, during the many months the siege ultimately required to run its full, devastating course. Surviving accounts describe desperate attempts by isolated groups within the city to negotiate separate terms of surrender or escape, efforts that consistently collapsed amid the broader paralysis gripping the royal court, leaving ordinary residents to face the full brunt of the siege's horrors, essentially without any organized leadership or protection from the government that had, for generations, promised to shield them from exactly this kind of catastrophe. The scale of suffering documented by outside observers during those final months remains almost unmatched among sieges of the early modern era, a grim testament to how completely a once magnificent imperial capital could be brought to its knees once the institutions meant to defend it had quietly rotted away from within, long before the first Afghan soldier ever appeared on the horizon. The fall of Isfahan triggered immediate, opportunistic chaos across the wider region. To the north, Russian forces under Peter the Great moved swiftly to seize Safavid territory along the Caspian coast, while Ottoman armies pushed in from the west, both powers rushing to claim pieces of a Persian empire that suddenly appeared to have no functioning central authority left to defend it. The Afghan conquerors, meanwhile, turned with brutal efficiency against the Safavid royal family itself, executing more than 3,000 members of the extended dynasty in a systematic campaign clearly designed to permanently eliminate any future claim to the throne, extinguishing the bloodline as thoroughly as military force could achieve. Amid this collapse, one royal survivor, Tahmasp II, managed to escape and attempted to organize a government in exile, a shadow claim to legitimacy with little practical power behind it. But the figure who would truly determine Persia's next chapter emerged instead from the ranks of the military, a tribal commander named Nader Koli, who would soon become known to history as Nader Shah, a military genius later compared by historians to Napoleon for his battlefield brilliance and relentless ambition. Nader waged a series of ruthless, highly effective campaigns that drove the Afghan occupiers, the Ottoman invaders, and the Russian forces out of Persian territory in turn, restoring the country's borders through sheer military skill and calculated brutality. For a time, he governed in the name of the surviving Safavid royal line, using the dynasty's remaining legitimacy as political cover while consolidating his own personal power behind the scenes. That arrangement lasted only so long. In 1736, Nader Shah formally deposed the last Safavid ruler, by that point a mere infant barely old enough to walk, and declared himself Emperor of Persia in his own right, bringing a definitive close to a dynasty that had endured for more than 2 centuries. 3 lessons emerge from this long, blood-soaked history. Persia's geography, a land without clear natural defensive borders, condemned it to perpetual conflict on every side, generation after generation. The harem system, designed to protect the throne from internal rivals, instead systematically destroyed the competence of the very rulers meant to lead the empire. And religion, wielded as a tool of political unification under Ismail, ultimately created permanent, self-perpetuating enemies both within and beyond Persia's borders. A sectarian divide between Shia Iran and its Sunni neighbors that remains one of the defining geopolitical fault lines of the modern Middle East, its roots traced directly back to a 14-year-old boy's battlefield declaration in Tabriz, more than 5 centuries ago. Nader Shah's own subsequent reign, built directly on the wreckage of Safavid collapse, would go on to achieve extraordinary military conquests of its own, briefly making Persia, once again, one of the most feared military powers in Asia, complete with a campaign that sacked Delhi itself and hauled home treasures, including the legendary Peacock Throne. Yet Nader's empire, built with the very same reliance on a single ruler's personal military genius, and utterly lacking any of the institutional durability needed to survive his death, collapsed into renewed chaos almost immediately after his own assassination in 1747, a final, almost poetic echo of the exact same structural weakness that had doomed the Safavid dynasty he had replaced. Isfahan's turquoise domes still stand today, their tilework as breathtaking as ever, silent witnesses to an empire that mastered the art of beauty and conquest in equal measure, but never once solved the far harder problem of how to survive its own success. The Safavid legacy, despite the dynasty's catastrophic collapse, proved considerably more durable in certain respects than the empire's final humiliating decades might suggest. The establishment of Twelver Shia Islam as Iran's dominant religious identity, first imposed by Ismail's forced conversion campaign at the point of a sword, evolved over subsequent centuries into a genuine, deeply rooted national and cultural identity that would go on to shape Iranian politics, society, and its relationship with its Sunni Arab and Turkish neighbors for the next 500 years and counting, including its profound influence on the modern Islamic Republic of Iran, established in the 20th century. What began as calculated political strategy by a teenage conqueror, desperate to distinguish his fledgling state from Ottoman rivals, ultimately outlasted the empire that created it by a margin measured in centuries rather than decades, a testament to how thoroughly religious identity, once deeply embedded within a population's sense of collective self, can persist long after the political structures that first imposed it have crumbled into historical memory.